Hi, APE students from far and wide. Welcome to the College Board's first virtual lesson for AP Environmental Science. My name is Ms. Fassler, and I teach at Marshfield High School in Marshfield, Wisconsin. I'm so glad that you decided to join us today. Many of you have probably gotten all of your communication from the College Board or from your teachers about units 8 and 9, that they are not going to be assessed on the exam. Some of you may have covered some of this material in your courses already. Some of you may not have. So I just wanted to be very clear why the College Board is going ahead and offering some of the content from units 8 and 9. Colleges and universities came together very quickly and worked with the College Board to offer you a somewhat modified exam and yet still give you your full credit for the coursework that you did in APES. And so we just felt there should be some kind of agreement that we offered that material to you to give you the full scope and sequence of the course. Sort of piggybacking on that idea, Dr. Sowell and I, the other APES teacher that you're going to see off and on with myself, we got a lot of cool stories to tell from units 8 and 9 yet that are going to really make some nice connections to the content that you've already learned, provide some review as we're going through those. Lots of great career options that we can talk about and really reinforce the content that you've already had. In addition to that, everything we do, any new content that we introduce, starting with unit 8 on aquatic and terrestrial pollution, we're always going to tie that back and link it and spiral back to some of the content from units 1 through 7 that you are going to be assessed on. And we're really going to focus on those science skills and practices. So let's go and jump into a little bit of a warm up. I know a couple of us have been off for a couple weeks. We haven't been maybe doing a whole lot. So to kind of get our brains back in gear and working, let's go back to unit 7 on atmospheric pollution. It's going to be really easy for us to make a connection between what you learned about in that unit on pollution and what I'm going to introduce today in aquatic and terrestrial pollution. And again, really focusing on those science skills and practices. So in unit 7 on atmospheric pollution, this is one of the really big science practices that we focused on. Number 5, data analysis, analyzing and interpreting quantitative data represented in a table, a chart, or a graph. And you can see that I break that science practice down and I kind of start off with a pretty simple skill and then scaffold. And by the time I'm done with this practice, I'm going to start by describing a pattern. I'm going to look at relationships among variables for that quantitative graph that I have. And finally, I want to be able to draw some conclusion and relate that back to the content so I can explain that pattern. So let's start off with a graphic representation of some data from atmospheric pollution. This is the kind of graph that you might see even on an FRQ, and they could ask you to use that skill to explain the relationship between the variables, or again, kind of extend that into drawing a conclusion about some bigger environmental process. Many of your teachers perhaps use this technique called I-squared, identify, interpret. You don't have to worry about the formal name for that. It's just a simple strategy that we want to review as I look at quantitative data to make sure I can describe the pattern and find the relationship between the variables. So the first part of that I-squared is identify. What do I see? And I always like to kind of look at the title of the graph and the labels of the X and the Y axis first. So what jumps out at me from that title? I got a bunch of lines there, but the lines are showing me something about gases. So I know this is going to be air pollution. It's over a city. So that's an urban area, not in a rural area. And it's a smoggy day. So smoggy to me sort of says, oh, there's been a lot of maybe emissions, maybe there's a lot of vehicle traffic. As I look at the x-axis, my independent variable, that's time of day. And I'm starting early in the morning, even before sunrise. and I'm going to early afternoon, looks like end about 1 o'clock there. And my y-axis, my dependent variable, is concentration in parts per million. So what do I see? Well, I can see that the concentration of all the gases tends to start off low. They all start in the same point, and they all start to increase as I go through over time. I also see that they all tend to reach a peak, and then that concentration tends to come back down again. They don't all go up at the same rate. They don't all peak at the same place. They don't all peak at the same concentration. They don't all peak at the same time. But those are just things that I can observe as I look at that quantitative data. The other part of the I squared is interpret. What does that mean, all those observations that I just made? Well, remember that science practice, I want to make a connection between those variables. So what I can see is that there's a relationship between time of day and concentration of gases or air pollutants over a city on a smoggy day. Now, let's see how they might ask me something about this on a free response question, and getting to that most advanced part of that science skill, being able to draw a conclusion based on this quantitative data. So mentally, I just kind of in my head went through and I made sense of that graph. And I said, okay, here's that relationship. Now, how do I take all of that information that I just processed and use it to draw some kind of conclusion? Well, the fact that these gases are peaking at different times of day, what really is jumping out to me here, and what I can explain based on this data, why is it that that concentration of ozone peaks last? And it starts out low and then gets to high concentrations following peak concentrations of hydrocarbons, those VOCs, volatile organic chemicals, and the peak concentrations of NOx. And if you recall from your air pollution unit, those are both what we would call precursors. They are the reactants or ingredients that are necessary for that chemical reaction that creates ground level ozone. So now that we're all kind of warmed up and thinking about science practices and we're all back in the apes groove, let's take a look at what we're going to cover in our lesson today. So remember, we're now just going to introduce concepts from Unit 8, aquatic and terrestrial pollution, and I'm going to be covering parts of these three different learning targets. Sources of pollution, I'm going to touch on human impacts. Dr. Sowell is going to come back and do a lot more on those tomorrow. And then I'm going to go into thermal pollution. And I've highlighted or bolded the science processes, those skills that we really want to reinforce. So we kind of have three objectives for today. Introduce but spiral back and link new content to the content that you are going to be assessed on the exam. Reinforce those practices and skills that are common and global on the national exam, and then give you a little bit of assessment opportunity to see how you're doing. So let's start off with what you need to know. Our first target is this 8.1 sources of pollution. And again, you've been talking about other sources of pollution throughout the year. This is a very simple target for the most part. It ties in very well to all of our previous learning, because if you look at those essential knowledge statements, it's really defining a point source of pollution comes from a single identifiable point. So in atmospheric pollution, that could have been an emissions pipe from a coal burning power plant. It could be the exhaust or tailpipe from my vehicle. In aquatic pollution, that might be a pipe that is discharging some type of waste directly into an aquatic ecosystem, a coastal area, a lake, or a river. So our goal is to be able to describe an environmental concept and process and distinguish between point and non-point sources of pollution. And then again, that more advanced skill, kind of apply that to explaining a model in this case. So point, a single identifiable source. Non-point sources of pollution, my knowledge statement here uses the word diffused. That means kind of diluted, kind of dispersed in low concentration across an area. And it's because of that, that they're harder to control because I don't see exactly that pipe where that pollutant is coming from. So let's go into a little bit more detail here. Here is a diagram that shows a very simple example of point and non-point source of pollution. Oh, it's a river in Wisconsin. So one point source of pollution could be if I have human waste being discharged. In my example here, along the banks of the river is somebody that has a cabin, and the point source of discharge is this tailpipe that comes out of their bathroom, and it's discharging their waste directly into the river. So somebody from the Department of Natural Resources could go and say, oh, hey, I see that there's some human fecal waste coming from your cabin. We are going to need to fine you for that, and you're going to need to come up with an alternative solution. Factory, certainly before the passage of the Clean Water Act, factories would often release industrial effluent. They would discharge waste that could have anything from organic chemicals to heavy metals. And what's really exciting is that we're going to come back to look at some of these specific pollutants. Dr. Sowell's going to do that tomorrow. He's going to talk about wastewater treatment. And I'm going to talk on Friday a little bit about persistent organic chemicals. Again, so you get that really complete picture. Here's what the pollutant is, here's how it gets into the environment, and here's how I as a human then may get exposed to that as well. So let's just do a quick little check and see how this topic may be assessed on an FRQ exam. Identify one point source of pollution and explain how that pollutant that you identified entered the environment. What you want to keep in mind is that that process of explaining, that skill of explaining, that's a verb. I mean, to explain a process requires that I have a verb in there. So I would like you, if you've got some scratch paper, some recycled paper right on the back of a box or something, why don't you just take a minute and see if you can identify from any unit you've just talked about a point source of pollution and explain how that pollutant entered the environment. So one example that you could have used from atmospheric pollution is particulate matter. Particulate matter is a point source of pollution. It can be discharged. That's my verb to explain that process. It can be discharged into the atmosphere directly from the smokestack of the plant. And you might be able to picture that even from your unit on energy when you looked at how during the combustion of coal, I heated water and made steam and turned a turbine and powered a generator. Let's take just a second as we continue moving here to look at those task verbs. In the previous question, you saw the term identify. These are the verbs that are commonly used on free response that give the student an indication of how they're going to answer that question. So identify is the easiest one. Notice that in the description of the identify task verb, I don't have to provide any elaboration or explanation. In the example I used, I simply said a point source of pollution is particulate matter, period. I'm done, point, I got my identify point. The second part of that, the command term, was explain how. And again, we were explaining a process. And so that explain how requires some additional information. We're going to be practicing all of these task verbs a lot throughout the next couple of weeks through units 8 and 9, and when we get into the review. So non-point sources of pollution, if you remember from our original essential knowledge statement, those were the pollutants that were diffuse and they're kind of hard to identify. And here are some examples. This is where we really link back a lot to Unit 5, where you looked at land use. And there's a lot of different like subtopics under land use. You had impacts of urbanization, impacts of feedlots in industrial agriculture, impacts of clear cutting or logging. So it really incorporates this idea of watershed and runoff. Remember, in our definition of non-point, we had that concept that once something happens on the land and that substance can get dissolved in water or snow melts and it carries it down off the land, it's going to ultimately end up in a body of water, surface water like lakes or rivers or streams, or it ultimately could end up in a coastal ecosystem, the Gulf of Mexico. And tomorrow, Dr. Sewell is really going to bring this idea full circle. He's going to come back to non-point pollution and advance that topic a little bit by looking a lot at what goes on a watershed. In my image here, oh my God, there's a cow pooping on the watershed. What this is really trying to illustrate is if I had a large CAFO, remember those concentrated animal feeding operations or feedlots, where there'd be a large concentration of animals and then it rained and all of that manure would wash off into the surface water. And again, we're going to talk on Friday about some of the things that are in those pollutants and the human health aspect of that. So they took some of our pictures out that we had used tonight. You have a big blank slide, but just in your head, go back to Unit 5 and think about all those land use practices and how what we do on the land, clear cutting, urbanization, large scale agriculture, could ultimately impact the quality of water through point and non-point sources of pollution. So here's a quick free response prompt to see if you get that idea of non-point source of pollution. And again, it's going to give us an opportunity to practice one of those task verbs, which in this case would be to justify the claim. And so here is the claim that you're going to justify. A neighbor proposes using compost rather than synthetic fertilizer on a garden, stating that synthetic fertilizer would have a negative effect on water quality of local streams. Justify this claim. And in order to justify that, you kind of have to explain a process. I'll give you a minute for that. Make sure you're using recycled paper. So here would be a good way to justify that claim by describing that process. So synthetic fertilizers would be more likely to dissolve in rainwater and run off into local streams. The impact of that would be to increase concentration of nitrates. And that's just a really big non-point source of pollution now. Again, that we'll talk about a little bit more. Just kind of a final note on non-point sources of pollution, and it relates back to the Clean Water Act, which you may or may not have talked about. Remember, you've already talked probably a little bit earlier in the year about aquatic ecosystems a little bit. So some of this isn't completely new to you. The Clean Water Act, one of our cornerstone federal pieces of environmental legislation in the US, passed in the early 1970s, did an amazing job at controlling point source of pollution, because they could go up to that factory and say, oh, you have a tailpipe going into the Ohio River. We're going to fine you, and you need to come up with a solution to treat that waste and not just discharge it directly into the river. Where we feel the Clean Water Act needs to go next is really addressing non-point sources of runoff. And again, you're going to get a lot on that tomorrow. It's a really exciting area in terms of water quality. Look, lots of career opportunities in aquatic ecology, fisheries management. So there's just lots of good connections for you to make to other units and skills and practices as well. So let's next go to a couple of those other learning targets that we want to address in our first virtual session today. We're going to touch on part of the essential knowledge from Unit 2, Human Impacts on Ecosystems. Dr. Sowell will come back to that tomorrow. And then we're going to link that into this idea of thermal pollution. So I've kind of highlighted in this part of 8.2, there's lots of different essential knowledge statements in 8.2. We're going to focus on one or two of them today. What we're looking at right now is this idea of range of tolerance. That probably sounds a little familiar to you because, oh, look, back in 2.4, you did ecological tolerance. It refers to the conditions such as temperature, sunlight, pH, that an organism can withstand. Note that all of those are abiotic conditions. So again, we're just reiterating a lot of the content that we already learned about way back in Unit 2 in ecosystems, looked at basic ecological principles. In Unit 8, they come back to that and say, okay, now that we understand that there's this ecological tolerance, what happens when organisms exceed that range of tolerance? Or what happens when they get outside that optimal range of tolerance? And I will point out that part of the definition that I highlighted there, organisms may experience physiological stress, limited growth, or reduced reproduction. And I didn't highlight the in extreme cases death. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Well, if this idea of range of tolerance is the span of abiotic conditions over which an organism can survive, one of those key abiotic conditions that's pretty easy for us to understand is temperature. In other words, how do changes in temperature affect the physiological strength of an organism? And that physiological stress, that idea is just a way of saying, how healthy is it? Is it able to simply survive, but it's kind of sick? And maybe that change in temperature is impacting metabolic rate or ability of immune system to function, or its ability, reproductive capability, or maybe its young aren't as healthy when they're produced in that environment. So we're going to focus on this idea of thermal pollution and relate that to range of tolerance. So here's a very simple range of tolerance graph. You've probably seen ones like this already in your textbook. Remember that learning target about making sense out of a model and being able to explain an ecological concept from apes by looking at a model. So we're going to start by looking at this simple model of range of tolerance to practice that skill. And kind of like that I-square technique that I did, I want to break down what the model is showing me, just like I broke down what that quantitative graph was showing me. So I've got temperature, there's my abiotic condition. The term performance, that's how well my organism is doing. So I can see that across, this is a very generic, simple model to start with. Across this range of temperatures, there's an optimal range, that optimal range of tolerance over which organisms are not just going to survive, but they individually as an organism or even as a species, maybe that whole population of fish in a stream, they're not just going to survive, they're going to grow. They're going to be pretty healthy. And not only are they going to grow, but they're going to reproduce. And so this is that optimal range so that they're really healthy and they have a high performance. They're not under stress because the temperature got too high or too cold, too hot or too cold. Notice as I move either hotter or colder away from there, I get into this zone where they're surviving and they're growing, but their reproductive capacity has been greatly reduced. Maybe survivorship of offspring has been reduced. And finally, I get out to these extremes. They haven't died yet, but all they're doing is surviving, and their numbers are probably quite a bit lower. So that's a pretty straightforward graph to visualize, a model to visualize. Now let's make that connection to why do we care if the temperature gets, in this case, too warm. So when we talk about thermal pollution, it's one of those things where I don't add an actual pollutant to the water. I'm not adding mercury, or I'm not adding livestock waste that could have high levels of nitrates or coliform bacteria. I am simply discharging, and it's usually a point source of discharge from an energy plant. So if you think back to your energy unit, when you had a coal burning power plant or you had a nuclear power plant that was fissioning atoms of uranium-234, remember they all needed water as a coolant. Picture like the big sloping cooling towers in a nuclear power plant. And I've got to I fission those atoms or burn that coal. I heat water, I make steam, I turn a turbine, and I power a generator. So if that plant, or it could be an industrial process as well, if that plant releases water, hot or warm water, above the normal water temperature of the local stream, for example, that's what we call thermal pollution. And the big problem with that is that it affects yet another abiotic factor of an aquatic ecosystem, in this case, dissolved oxygen. Now, understand that if you want to dig in more to thermal pollution, there are certain other direct effect on species, thermal shock, changes in metabolic rate for cold-blooded organisms. But the connection we're going to take a minute and make here is how it influences gas solubility. So if you remember, when I increase the temperature, those oxygen molecules are dissolved in water, and that's how aquatic organisms get their oxygen. They don't have like the little alveoli in their lungs where there's a gas exchange like we have. That water passes over their gills, and that dissolved gas diffuses directly into their bloodstream. So if the water temperature gets too warm, I lower the ability of that water solution to hold dissolved oxygen gas. Think of that, those warm water molecules are moving around with all kinds of kinetic energy, and those oxygen molecules are jumping out of solution. The analogy would be as if you opened a can of soda, gas dissolved in the soda is carbon dioxide, the fizziness of it. If you put it in the fridge, it's going to stay fizzy because that carbon dioxide is going to stay in solution longer if it is cold than if you leave it out on the counter where it's going to get warm. So let's go through and do an example using range of tolerance. I have a diagram here. There's a few more labels on it. And we're going to practice that skill again. Describe how a population of steelhead trout will be impacted by an increase in the average temperature of the stream in which they live. Oh, we got a bunch of trout swimming around there. If you hadn't noticed, I'm wearing my fishing jacket. We're still just wrapping up ice fishing in Wisconsin, but pretty soon the ice will melt, and then we'll be out doing just regular fishing on the lakes. So let's go back to that I-squared technique we used early and take a minute to make sense of the graph and see if you can jot down a response. Describe how a population of steelhead trout will be impacted by an increase in temperature. Recycled paper. So one of the things you could have said there in your describe how is that if the average temperature increases, it will be outside the range of tolerance for some organisms that live there. Boy, what a powerful term to have in my vocabulary, because anytime I change an abiotic condition, I don't care if I'm on land or in the water, if I alter any abiotic condition, pH, salinity, temperature, dissolved oxygen, it may be outside the range of tolerance for whatever species or organism is living there. And so when that temperature is outside the range of tolerance, the trout are not going to be as successful. They will be experiencing physiological stress. They won't grow and reproduce as successfully. So there's a lot of different ways I can say, once I'm outside the range of tolerance, here I'm describing how they are impacted in a nice, concise way. Not really a misconception, but one of the points I want to make in terms of reading exams, A lot of times, and this is just a broad concept, and to be honest, it really relates a lot to atmospheric pollution and the human health impacts of atmospheric pollution. You want to be careful about always saying that it kills something. I understand that our essential knowledge statement, it said there's physiological stress or even death. But if the specific question that you're addressing, for example, if I look back on my steelhead trout here, I don't know off the top of my head what the range of tolerance is for a steelhead trout. And I don't know if 9 degrees is necessarily going to kill them. I mean, according to this, that's the zone of intolerance. They're probably not living there, but these labels maybe wouldn't have been on a diagram. So you want to be careful. And we want to make sure we have that description that when outside the range of tolerance, those organisms, they don't grow and reproduce. Or those, I think, are a pretty easy way for you to remember what happens when we get outside that optimal range, which in the case of the steelhead trout is between 13 and 21 degrees Celsius. So again, just be careful that you're not killing them, because depending on the specific situation, it may not have been an extreme enough condition to actually kill them. So let's do a quick check for understanding to see how you feel about range of tolerance. Here's an example of a released exam question on range of tolerance. And I'm going to give you a couple of minutes again to try to jot this down. Just skip this section here about hydrogen ion concentration. We'll just read the background information, and then you can answer the first half of A and prompt B. The diagram represents the pH ranges, it's my abiotic condition, of selected aquatic organisms exist. The solid figures represent pH organisms, the pH ranges at which the organism will thrive. Notice that you have, sometimes you're shown sort of a shaded figure where the conditions are less favorable, but they survive. And if there is no symbol there at all, it simply means they're beyond the range of tolerance. So why don't you go ahead and try to answer that question. How are we doing? All right, let's check to see how you did. So the brook trout can survive or thrive, excuse me, in a pH range from 5.5 to 7. Notice that the key part there was thrive. And so I had to kind of make sense of my diagram a little bit, the shaded versus the unshaded. And then the rainbow trout would be the best indicator. They have a pretty narrow range of tolerance. Notice that once it got a little bit below a pH of 6, or that pH of 5.8 that I was looking at, my brook trout were there, but they weren't thriving. They were not able to grow and reproduce. They were under physiological stress. So again, in bringing to closure some ideas about this range of tolerance, it's a very broadly applied concept to a lot of different abiotic conditions. And it allows me to describe a connection from the ecology unit between biotic and abiotic components of the ecosystem. So let's look at an AP exam practice question. Oh, wait a minute. There's one less little learning target from section 8.2 that I wanted to mention, and that's on oil spills. If we were assessing Unit 8, we'd go into a lot more detail on oil spills. I just want to present some introductory information here so that we can make sure and link it back to some prior content. You probably remember from your energy unit, one of the main focuses in the energy unit was taking all these different resources or forms of energy and saying, all right, how do we use them? What kind of energy do we get from them? But really the big thing is, what are the pros and cons? What's the advantage and disadvantage of different energy resources? And certainly one big disadvantage of using petroleum as an energy resource is that it can lead to oil spills. So depending on how I transport that oil, I can transport that oil in a pipeline, overland. I can transport that oil under the ground in a pipeline. I can transport that oil in an oil tanker. So I can load it up, that oil up from an offshore platform, load it onto a tanker and transport that oil via a tanker. So they hold a lot of oil. We transport an amazing amount of oil, millions of barrels a day used just in the United States alone. And there are many potentials for that oil spill to happen. So I have just a cute little video here for a second on some of the problems that oil spills cause.
Have these penguins been yarn bombed? Nope, it's just the most adorable knitwear in the world that wildlife advocates say can actually save the birds' lives. I'm Jen Markham on Buzz 60. Penguins usually don't need a sweater on a chilly day. They live in the coldest environments on the planet. Every day is a chilly day. But wildlife advocates say when a penguin is caught in an oil spill, the oil can separate and tangle their feathers, compromising that protective heating and waterproofing layer. Even worse, the penguins can end up eating the oil when they try to clean it off their feathers. That's why the Penguin Foundation started a program called Knits for Nature, asking volunteers to knit sweaters for the penguins on Phillip Island, Australia, to keep them warm and protected. The group provides a knitting pattern to download so volunteers know the size, and they even hold a yearly contest with
Oh, so that was pretty cute. Seeing the little penguins with their sweaters. So one of the benefits of the sweaters was, again, so that they stayed warm, because the oil interferes with their insulating capability of their feathers or their fur. And one of the biggest issues, however, with the oil spills on marine organisms is that they ingest that oil when they're preening themselves. And that's a big idea we're going to come back to on Friday when we look at how wildlife and humans get exposed to some of those persistent organic chemicals like we find in that oil, in the hydrocarbon. So last chance then to do a little bit of assessment. The last learning target that, if you remember from the beginning, that we were going to address was doing some kind of mathematical routine. And I started us off with a couple easy ones. Dr. Sowell and I will give you lots of opportunity to practice different kind of mathematical routines. But here again is some quantitative data from a national exam question showing the amount of oil released during different oil spills. Remember, I got to break down what this graph is showing me. They're showing me both a low estimate and the darker shaded region a high estimate. It's oil spilled in millions of gallons. And that's an area where a lot of people are going to make a mistake. So I'm going to give you a chance to answer questions A and B. So let's see how you did on that math. In the first one, what I needed to do was add together for the Deepwater Horizon. That's an oil spill that some of you actually may have heard of. I had to add both of those two values together. Here's the one tricky thing, or an area where you may have made a mistake, is if you only put 340, you would have gotten it wrong. Remember, that's the benefit of looking at the labels of that X and Y axis to begin with. This is not just 200 barrels, it is 200 million barrels. So that's an area where they might snag you a little bit. And then in question number 2, a lot of times I tell my students when they're struggling with a math problem to sketch a little picture and try to visualize what the problem is asking you to calculate. So what they're saying is the total length of coastline of the Gulf of Mexico that was impacted with oil was 3,540 miles. Oh my gosh, that's just, it's hard to even imagine, isn't it? And understand that the Deepwater Horizon was an offshore oil platform. It was miles and miles off the coastline. So all of that oil through the wave and action of waves was brought into the coastal ecosystem. Of that total coastline, that's the total length of the coastline, 1,313 miles of it were impacted by oil. So that is just, it's not a percent change problem. It's just a percent problem, part over the whole times 100. So just a quick debrief. Let's look back at those objectives we had from the beginning of the lesson. We introduced some new content, but make sure we linked it back and reinforce some of the content that we spiraled back to from the first 7 units. We did hopefully a really good job of reinforcing some of those skills and practices that are global for our exam, and then gave you a little bit of guided instruction for some practice on that. Coming tomorrow, Dr. Sowell is going to talk about the environmental effects of different pollutants, and he's going to go back and review a lot of different kinds of aquatic ecosystems. Should be really exciting. I'll see you again on Friday to talk about persistent organic pollutants and endocrine disruptors. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fabulous rest of your day. Stay safe, all of you in the APES community. Bye.